Hey, it's Geoffrey from Ahead of the Curve. Welcome to another show. Today, I've got my guest, Sean Wargo from Avixa, and we spoke about some really interesting insights of how data is used inside of our industry. And we also spoke about just the general health of the industry as a whole. So check it out. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ahead of the Curve. Today, I have my guest, Sean Wargo on. Sean, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Geoffrey. Great to be here.
Great to have you as well. So, Sean, would you mind giving the viewers a little bit of background of who you are and where you came from and kind of how you got to where you are?
Sure, absolutely. So, Sean Wargo, Senior Director of Market Intelligence at Avixa, long acronym Audio, Visual, and Integrated Experience Association, for those who haven't heard of us. We are the trade organization, professional society covering Pro AV space. So, most known probably for certification education. Infocom, our big show that we didn't get to have in person this year. Looking forward to perhaps next year. But I'm on the market research side. So probably about 3 or 4 years ago, Avixa, then Infocom, decided to reimagine, revisit a lot of the research that it had been doing on the Pro AV space in the past, really realizing that we needed the story of this industry. We needed to be able to talk about, hey, how big is it? How fast it's growing? All that sort of stuff. So I came in with background really kind of spanning lots of different aspects of research, whether forecasting, survey work, polling work, about 20 plus years now in the technology research sector, formerly employed at the Consumer Technology Association, where I was doing industry analysis for them, spent time, as we all do, I think, at some point in our career on consulting.
Yep.
Tried my hand there, but ended up here at Avixa. Happy to be here now as we kind of re-explore this space and kind of look at what's going on, and what better time, in some ways, better or worse, than just the challenges we're facing now and needing some more insight and data about where we're going as an industry.
Well, it definitely shows, and it definitely shows kind of the challenges that we've had throughout throughout the years, and also illustrating the challenges that we're having now, and even the stability of the industries. I think we're starting to see some of we saw the initial impacts, but we're now starting to see kind of the fall throughs happen. 8 months later, almost. I can't believe to say it that we're approaching that 1 year mark here, not in the not too distant future. So it's definitely been some challenging and interesting times, I think, for us all. And I know with your background, in checking into market analytics and market research, it's probably been very interesting to see some of these trends and see some of the differentiation happening from a course of what was a really good, solid economy up and through March when we got the news.
For sure, it's a great time to be a researcher and a challenging one at the same time, because there's never perhaps been more need for that kind of insight, data, and direction. And yet things are changing so fast, and have been changing so fast, where it's just you're moving from data point to data point. Things may change from one to the next. A good example is, we obviously track, as we're interested in people returning to trade shows in person, asking them the simple question, when are you going to be comfortable coming back? And of course, it's a moving target, right? They say first, and then it's fall, and then it's winter, and then it's next summer. So you get this kind of changing dynamic. So it's been important, I think, for us, or we felt it's been important to at least capture and share data from within our audiences as we go, put some flags in the ground, make some statements, and actually at least provide some guidance, even if we know that some of the assumptions may change. So, and that's what it's all about, is as a researcher, kind of collecting, analyzing, pulling in, making assumptions, being bold in some cases, and being humble enough to know, well, yeah, we may have to adjust, we may have to account for different things as we go forward. But certainly exciting and interesting time to be doing all that.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think, with this, as you just mentioned, you've had a little bit of time to also maybe be able to spend a little bit more time analyzing some of this data and analyzing some of this research as you're not traveling as much, or, as the industry is kind of settled a little bit. So what have been actually some of the interesting finds that you found in the transition or in the change into this time?
One of the things we started doing pretty much right away, we have at our disposal members of our association and the marketplace joined what we call an intelligence panel, or an insight community is another way to look at it. We started doing surveys right away to them. We wanted to find out, hey, what are you seeing? You know, we would expect and hear anecdotally, of course, certain sectors are down dramatically, live events, the obvious one, other areas. But we really wanted to capture the story and be able to reflect back. This is, if you're experiencing this, so are others, and this is the kind of rate of impact that they're experiencing that. So you may have seen some videos from us, some research kind of in the March through July timeframe, weekly surveys to our experts to kind of see what was going on. It was dark. I think it's gosh, what is even the right way to describe it? It's a reality check when you get that data back each week and you say, gosh, I'm an optimistic person. I tend to like to see things half full.
On the bright side.
Yeah, exactly. Even as a researcher, a realist. But when you get this data back saying 20%, our revenues are down 20%, 100% in some cases, we're laying off 6 to 15% of our staff. And as you went through it, more and more of those layoffs became permanent in nature versus just sort of furloughs. So that becomes very real and yes, humbling as you go through it. Mm-hmm. That journey has really taught us a lot at Avixa about kind of the need to continually capture that insight and perspective from that marketplace, so we can kind of then say, hey, here's where we're heading. Here's the point at which we start to look better. So we get that inflection point, and allow people somewhat the catharsis, right, of being, or the healing of being able to share that perspective back out and quantify it as much as we can for people.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the interesting times. As I mentioned to you just before coming on, you know, I was one of those victims earlier on being laid off from the past employer that I had, and I know some of the other viewers are here. I saw a funny comment actually from Andy Towers saying, so you're saying consulting is a bad idea?
Right. Never a bad idea. I would encourage everyone to try it at least once. So much, honestly, that's been that time for me, and I'm sure many might reflect on it too, just the flexibility and diversity of work that you get to do in that time. Yeah, it's hard to be both a salesperson and the person doing the work as a consultant, as a sole proprietor. But boy, rewarding stuff being in the trenches with companies. I love this kind of work too, just being able to kind of reflect and in some ways Monday morning quarterback, but still in fun on both sides. Yeah.
I've personally always enjoyed the creative side, but I'm also a very analytical person in my core, and I've always enjoyed the research and analytics side of things. So kind of more on the practical side of life, if you will, and being a realist as much as humanly possible. But it's always fun to dream as well, and looking in different places. So. For sure. Just kind of getting into the market research side, what would you say is kind of diving a little bit deeper into that? What part of it do you find is kind of the most important element of the job that you do today for Avixa?
Well, it is a good question, because there's a lot of pieces of the process that are crucial, right? So you start, of course, with, you know, framing up your questions and listening to the marketplace first, and kind of understanding what are the prevailing questions of the day. Is it, you know, where are the areas of growth? Is it tell me best practices? Tell me what are clients, end user, buyers of technology solutions? What are they looking for? So you kind of start with that perspective of understanding where the question marks are, the unknowns, and then developing your methodology to frame up, how do I go after it? Do I do surveys? Do I consult an expert? Do I do a macroeconomic study? Those kinds of things. And then of course, there's the process of, once you've done it, looking at the data, applying that lens of, we know what was important, how can we share that back out and translate it into something that's actionable? That's probably the hardest part, because you can get questions, you can frame methods, you can get data, you can analyze data, but knowing how that's going to be useful to an individual company really kind of brings up that consulting story again. You have to be able to work with individuals and kind of understand, all right, well, here's how that might be applied to business. So all of that kind of is important. Then the last step of that is sharing it in a way that's useful, informative. These kinds of engagements, one-on-one conversations, presentations, webinars. So you wear a lot of hats as an analyst slash researcher in the space. It's hard to say any one of those is the most important. But if I had to say, you kind of start with the beginning of the rest flows from listening and how well you listen to what what the marketplace needs to know, wants to know, has to know in order to go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you answered partially what my next question was going to be, which is kind of how do you gain that data? How do you bring that data back in? You know, what are kind of some of the things that you look at to be able to collect the data and be able to compose the numbers that you present?
Mm-hmm. We talked about surveys. That's one piece. So that kind of organized effort, questionnaires, et cetera, to go out to your audiences, your marketplace, your constituents, whoever it is. We have that at our disposal, of course. But there's other processes. So a lot of what we do, actually, we have a big study we do once a year that we launch in June. It's our industry outlook trends analysis. Essentially, think of it as a sizing exercise. How big's our industry? Where's the area of growth? How's it differ geographically, et cetera? So you start with a lot of different pieces that you kind of pull together. You talk to manufacturers. What are they seeing? How big's their specific contribution? Distributors as well, how much is flowing through their channel, and then last but not least, the boots on the ground, the ones that are actually selling, installing, servicing the solutions, and a little bit of the demand side too. So you kind of put that in. It's almost like getting in the kitchen, right? You put it all
making your soup.
You have to make the soup, and it's not pretty always. Make assumptions. You have to make assumptions. You have to clarify and make transparent those assumptions. And that's what kind of gets you to the end result. So somebody brought up the challenges at this time, in forecasting, and it comes down to, what assumptions are you going to make as you go through? You have to make some. We all make some. Like, what's the timing on a vaccine? What's the reality of a second wave? What's the reality of consumers gaining confidence again and coming back to in-person activity? You have to put a flag in that and say, this is what we think. You may disagree, fine. We go over and under with that conversation, but kind of putting it all out there. I think good researchers, honestly, are honest. They tell you too, here's how we did it, here's the assumptions we're making, so that you then can interpret based upon your situation, your business, your area of focus.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and I just have to thank you for all the work that you do because it's a very it's a hard thing that you do, and it's hard to collect all that information and also pull together those assumptions. It's not an easy thing. So thank you for all the work that you do, and of course all the work that Avixa has been doing as well.
Of course, I have to say though, Geoffrey, in honesty, it's rewarding work, but at the same time too, I'd say the hard work is those that actually then have to take it and apply it, right? You got to make decisions that people's livelihood, like we're talking about layoffs and, furloughs and all that sort of stuff. So I appreciate the thanks back, but boy, I'm humbled by the fact, having been there too and made some of those decisions off data. That's the hard work for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting too to see some people just use the ignorance is bliss method.
Or gut check, right? I mean, it's especially in the business that we are in. I'd say Pro AV especially has come from being very more cottage oriented, networking, boots on the ground, kind of that interactive. And so what you do in that situation, you run on gut. You say, I know my customer. I talk to them all the time. I know what they want. And that there's nothing inherently wrong by that, by itself. But I think as we're talking about, it becomes hard to persist in that when you get these major disruptions like we're facing now. You almost have to step back and say, what else could I be learning? Maybe my customer pipeline is drying up a little bit. There's not as much opportunity. And so kind of opening your ears and eyes to what else is going on out there. Data can help that. Research can help that. Always taken with a grain of salt. But yeah, I think that's the challenge. How do you combine that gut, that experiential feel with a bit of that analytic approach?
Yeah, without a doubt. And it's been interesting going through, as you mentioned, like a lot of people have been going through this phase of transition and have been going through this phase of kind of reinventing themselves and trying to find new ways to be creative, finding new ways to make income, of course. A lot of it has, I'm sorry, not a lot of it, but there have been a number of people and a number of outlets right now that have been kind of moving towards the whole virtualization of everything. So, here we are right now, as you mentioned before the call, seeing a lot more content that's web-based that's coming out and going out, all this content that's being created in different outlets and different means in different ways. Production's going completely virtual, and seeing those different pipelines and those different workflows kind of come together. Berto, actually, who's on the show, who was my very first guest here. Hi, Berto. He quickly got into extended reality workflows, and he'd been working in extended reality before moving in there and AR and VR, but kind of pushing that more into the broadcast area. And we've been seeing a lot of push into these extended reality and kind of virtual workflows going into live production, and working their way into broadcast and down through film and some of these different areas. So I was just wondering, with the impacts on live entertainment, do you have any feedback or any data that would pertain to the live events industry as a whole?
We've certainly been tracking it from a impact to revenues and companies and all those sorts of things. This story is a challenging one. I mean, when we came out with our forecast in June for industry growth decline for 2020 and then on, we had thought, all right, things may be better. And as I said before, we wanted to be somewhat optimistic about our ability to kind of adapt, recover, and emerge from all of this. So, June, really May, April, we're thinking Q3, Q4, late, maybe we have vaccines. Maybe we got this thing under control, the virus under control a bit better. So we could go back to more in-person. Reality check, obviously, that hasn't quite come to fruition, at least not here in North America, maybe in places like China, Asia, etc. So we were thinking only, let's go 2% decline in revenues for live events, understanding, as you just noted, I think that some revenue would come from digitization, virtualization, the shift to in workflows to support content capture, optimization, post-production support, and distribution out. And that is, I do think that has happened to some degree, but it's the business of rental and staging, still clearly is heavily impacted, even if there's some ability to rent, lease equipment out to an event company who's still going to say stage part of their content on a platform. They need better cameras, they need lighting, they need all that sort of stuff. They maybe have one speaker, they're recording it. I've done a couple of those over the last 9 months. So that's an opportunity for continuation. But I think in the end, we're looking at a space that's probably half its size in 2020 that it was in 2019. And that's best case, and that's a global number.
So what do you think the feeling is towards kind of moving into 2021?
I think all signs right now, if you look at, and once again, this comes down to assumptions, but let's start with vaccines. So I think the research, ours and all others, really points to people feel most safe and secure once there's a vaccine path out. Treatments help, of course, as well, but a way of knowing that the people around you can be somewhat protected by that. The use of guidelines, all those sorts of things also help. As we look at it now, things point to say Q1, Q2 latest for at least some broader availability and distribution of vaccines. So that puts us about mid-year when events kind of hit their stride. We're hoping so. Certainly, we've got 2 big ones in June next year. but we're also based on data and see that that seems realistic based upon what's out there and where we're headed with things. I tell you though that the thing that worries me a little, or it concerns from a research perspective, is you do see this overhanging of confidence issue among consumer. So even if and where it's safe to return, we're going to be dealing with that for a little while. And I think as show organizers, we're all hopeful. You don't want to be the first one because you kind of want people to get more and more used to it and hopefully open up. But somebody's got to be first. I'd say there's firsts happening in parts of the world now. But I'd say, yeah, as we look at Q2, certainly that's when things look a lot better. Gosh, 21 could be a real busy year for all of us from an event standpoint, as all that pent-up demand kind of gets released out. Shows come back, concerts come back, theater comes back, that sort of stuff will keep us.
Yeah, it's going to be, I mean, I think a lot of us are definitely very hopeful that things are going to spin back around in 2021. You know, I look at it kind of as a phase. You have a series of phases more than anything. And we've gone through the panic phase and we're starting to settle in. You know, a lot of the restrictions are starting to be slightly lifted, even though numbers have been more on the incline in some different areas of the world. But I think people and countries are starting to actually figure out ways to live with it and move on and deal with the risk. And I think that's been the biggest problem more than anything is, you know, that kind of risk to life scale, whether you're going to take the risk and catch COVID, or if you're going to just kind of say, you know what, I'm going to move on and just live life and be cautious and wash my hands and take all the precautions I possibly can, but still get out and you know, get out there and work and live.
Yeah. It's the calculation we all have to make every day between, what is my personal risk for doing something versus the benefit that I get from it. And this has thrown our personal calculations all out of whack. We don't really know how to think about the fact that there's this virus out there that seems to be like the boogeyman. It shows up in your closet and just, you know, jumps out at you at weird times. So it's hard to conceptualize that. But as business owners, and I think that's something we do every day, right? We're in business too. You're used to looking at risks that are out there and making calculated taking on those calculated risks to grow your business. I like your story about the kind of XR, VR sorts of stuff. As I'd say, you know, a learning from this, right, is that we need to make sure we're leaving ourselves the time and space to be creative. So we can adapt. We're giving ourselves a chance, a path. We're putting a path in place that then becomes a possibility, a real possibility, when we have to actually shift our business around. And I think some of the most successful businesses that we're seeing now, we've got about a quarter of our companies that are saying we're at full capacity. It's great to see. It's stark against those that are shut down, but it's a great to see. And I think a lot of that has been the willingness to be creative, adapt, take some risk, expand in new areas, learn new things, all that sort of stuff. Easy to say, right? But hard to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Andy saying, I know that COVID is very deadly, but so is living in the basement with a flashlight.
Very true, Andy. Or without a flashlight.
Or even without a flashlight. But, you know, Halloween's right around the corner. So do all those in their best.
Yes. I think we're each going to have this journey and make those assessments at a different rate. I think, hey, there are paths out. Even the guidelines that exist sometimes may feel stifling, but allow us to kind of go on. Look, hey, if you have to wear a mask to go outside your house, well, it's better than sitting in your basement with a flashlight, right? It's getting out. It's doing something. I wear my shirt. I could wear my mask, kind of thing.
Well, there's also the story of, you know, everybody just getting completely stir crazy and being cooped up in their house for months on end. You know, we're all craving just to get back out there. Hi.
Yeah.
Get Absolutely. Back out there and do something and even, you know, experience something. And it's been really neat to see, you know, these different transitions and people doing different things to be able to do that. The whole social distancing thing and taking precautions. A lot of just kind of getting back to your point about businesses moving forward. There's also been a lot of safety precautions that are now been put into place because of this, right? Temperature checks going in for different events, or temperature checks even going into a restaurant. A lot more sanitary products and stuff around that are easily accessible. People just taking a lot more precaution, and I think it's definitely paid off.
Yeah, I'd raise that too as a challenge and a question even out to our audience. One thing we've been wondering is all those precautions, all those guidelines also equate to additional complexity on the job. So there are provider installer integrators, that may have to face those kinds of checks as you go in. You got to do symptom check before your crew can get on-prem. You got to do extra cleaning after. You got to follow protocols while you're there. You have to have PPE in certain situations. So that can equal extra cost as well, potentially longer project timelines. So I've been curious about that too. We've gotten a little bit of feedback that yes, and in fact, I may have to pass some of that through to my client in the end, and that raises project rates to some degree. But it's something, we're watching. Hopefully it's not forever, but it is for now. So it's, I'd see it as a challenge. Would love to see anybody chime in about it as we go along.
Yeah, that's a absolutely fantastic question. Just to relate to that a little bit, I could tell you that my friend Kirsten was working here at Disney for basketball in general, for the NBA, because they were moving all their games down here, or down to Disney. And she mentioned that it was very rigorous. Everything was kind of encapsulated. Everybody working stayed on site in one of the Disney hotels. And they had to go through, they basically had different pods of people that had different levels of clearance. Even though they were healthy, they were being contained in these basically work pods, and they were scheduled to go onto site or onto the venue at different times to work together. So you couldn't have a large number of people on site at the same time. They were all scheduled during different times to basically be on job site, which I thought was an interesting approach, because you'd have the same people. But I also thought logistically it's got to be a bit challenging when you need to have answers, say, from a different department on site, and you now have to wait, maybe until the next day to be able to get those answers to continue on your work. So
I would imagine a challenge within that too is your composition per pod. So like you're talking about, you may need a variety. You could decide, I'm going to focus my pods on specific labor and skill sets, or diversify them so that I have multiple people to address issues as they come up. So I would think, you're creating a collaboration challenge, a transactional challenge as you do that. It's interesting. My son is at Virginia Tech, and they've recommended forming those kinds of social pods there too. So it sounds similar to the guidelines that we're getting in our social groups too. Stay with the same people, try to limit your exposure just there. And so
I guess it really makes sense. It also makes a lot of sense, of course, from an educational perspective as well, and keeping it contained into smaller groups. I think it helps ultimately. And it also poses an interesting question, kind of moving forward, what the future of themed events are going to be like, themed entertainment. Even going to theme parks, as I mentioned before, theme parks here in Orlando are now open to full capacity, but they're having very big problems reaching those numbers at all, getting to minimum capacity numbers at best. And when it has been busy, they've had to turn people away. The first time they did open up to the public, I remember, I think back in May, when Disney opened its doors, it had to turn people away from being able to enter the park. And I think that probably helped, kind of added to the problem ultimately, in having to turn your customer away at the door when you've got these restrictions in place. So
yeah, clearly not sustainable. I mean, we at least we had one round of stimulus and support from federal government, and at least there had been that to help some companies along. That in a lot of ways unprecedented, to face an unprecedented situation. But clearly our whole systems, let's look at stadiums, another good example, watching NFL, and you see some empty, some with a small number of people in them, but none of our infrastructures, none of our economies, our micro economies are set up for those kinds of low numbers. It thrives on volume and commerce and interaction and all those sorts of things. So good news is for us, as we do research on this, we really tend to be creatures of habit. And to go back, and there's good reason for that. In some cases, let's talk about movie theater as an example. I've heard of drive-in theaters kind of popping back up, and people trying to drive-in theaters since they can't go to a regular stadium seating theater inside. But stadium seating theaters are optimized for a great experience. It's better seating position. It's better screen quality, audio quality. So the same thing with in-person events, a trade show, a concert, all of those things evolved to be what they are, to be exceptional versions of themselves. So all that to say, I think research suggests, history suggests, we kind of go back to that. It's just getting through this period, bridging this gap. And this is where governments help. This is where we help each other to try to emerge and be able to flourish on the backside of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of flourishing in different states, how do you feel the pro AV market has been performing during these times? I know that on our side of the world that there's still projects, and the neat thing with working in pro AV is there are projects that are years out, several years out, and there are things that have been pushed or postponed due to the whole pandemic, but they're still happening. Projects are still happening. And I've been talking to a lot of people inside of these different spaces saying, with live events going down, they are going to come back, but there are still projects in the pro AV space that are pushing forward, and they are still going to happen. So there is still work available, and there is still chances to be able to learn new things and push forward into different segments of the industries.
Definitely. And what we're hearing, a few things are kind of happening as we look at the marketplace and look at how companies have been able to adapt or stay busy during this time frame. Higher ed, as an example, with classrooms having been empty and or in this kind of transitionary mode, some projects were pulled forward. There was the need to spool up and tool up to support these kind of synchronous or asynchronous learning modes. So investments there, investments in supporting remote work. So that certainly accelerated projects, office spaces kind of hanging empty, but the expectation that we would go back and need to rethink how those spaces are. So some consulting and design type of work we're hearing about out there as projects. We talked about events. I think that's been a good, if not painful, story of just facing the reality of, okay, well, how can we still support? There is all this online activity, virtualization. Let's think about how we can become supportive from a content distribution perspective. So plenty of examples. Does it mean that we are thriving? Does it mean that we are net growing? Not really. And I actually do have a data point I can pull up on this. It actually should be the active slide right now on your side, Geoffrey.
Okay, got it.
You kind of look, so one of the surveys, we do a monthly survey. We've done it for about 3 years now. We ask every single month, how is your revenue this past month versus a month prior? So kind of a rear view mirror, but at least an indication of health of the industry. What it does is creates what we call diffusion index. That just means if you see a number above 50 on one of the scores, you're in a growth mode. So you can't quite see it on the top chart here, sales index. But if you look, we were chugging along as we went into even March of this year, nice flat, and then you hit this drop off. And we went well below the 50, down into the 30-point range for sales index. Tells us net decline across our providers. So now we've come back, we're above 50, but we're kind of chugging along, right? We're not strongly above 50 like we used to be. We were in 60, almost 70 at times. So it tells me that companies have adapted. They picked up some project work. They're making do. Some are Some are more at full capacity because of the way in which their business was already headed. And as a result, some of them are starting to add back employment and staff. So the bottom index, the employment index, also right around that 50 mark. So not yet really growing in terms of bringing new staff into their companies. So we'll watch this on an ongoing basis because we're trying to find out when is the moment at which we can really say Pro AV as an industry is starting to net truly grow over what was peaks set in 2019. That's the kind of barometer we're using at this point. So just one way of looking at it, is it perfect? No, but it does give us at least that qualitative, quantitative kind of perspective on, are we getting there? How are we looking overall as an industry?
How would you feel that the other industries impact some of these numbers as well? Is this data just based off of the Pro AV industry as a whole, or would you say that this is indexed based off of the multiple different industries?
So this is the Pro AV channel. So we interview integrator, installers, live events professionals, the companies who are involved in the provision of AV technology and service. So they are going to reflect the demand from the industries that they serve, whether it's hospitality, retail, higher ed, corporate, government, etc. So this is kind of the downstream effect of what may be happening, as you're kind of alluding to, what's happening in any given sector, retail, hospitality, etc. We're going to reflect that because what they're able to buy, what they're willing to buy for technology will translate into these numbers in the end. So, and that is, see if I do have another slide, I think in this deck, let me see if I can pull it up as we're going here. We have a slide that looks at kind of the industry impacts. I'll see something.
Okay. Just, let me know when you got it. Is that it right now?
Yeah, I should have one up now called Vertical Impacts and Outlooks.
Yep.
So, as you would imagine, Pro AV, the clients of Pro AV, the solution buyers, let's call them, come from pretty much every aspect of an economy, whether it's hospitality buyers, retail buyers, transportation, education, corporate, etc. So what this chart is showing you, it's a bit to orient yourself, but if you look at the x-axis, it's how hard was that industry hit in 2020? If you go on the left, hardest hit, the major declines in revenue for Pro AV in that space. The vertical axis is how well are they going to recover in 2021? The lines across the middle kind of tell you averages. So if you're above that line, you're doing better, or if you're to the right of that line, you're doing better. If you're to the left or below, you're doing worse. Focus in on a couple, right, to kind of tell us the story of the industry impacts. Upper left, in 2020, venues and events, retail, when a brick and mortar being shut down, hospitality, nobody traveling, events, on-premise events, all that kind of thing shut down as well. So we're looking at, minus 14 to minus 18% declines in 2020 from that part of our industry, the amount of spending those industries were making on Pro AV solutions.
Okay.
As we go to the right, we see industries that we call them bellwethers in a way because they help the industry weather the storm. They may be longer range projects, could be like a transportation and energy, a government, military, where you've got long lead times, takes a while to scope a project, and once they're locked in, and so you can kind of continue with those. Education may not be as long range, but certainly had a lot of adaptation that it needed to go through to support the ability to return to classroom and or even support virtual classroom types of things. So education was one that we saw impacted a little less in 2020, may not be growing as fast as we go into 2021, like some of these top line industries are, but it helps you to start to see kind of where there's the opportunities. While something might have been hit really, really hard in 2020, we're looking at those as once they come back, we start to enter into a flourishing and an adaptation phase, an innovation phase, can yield opportunity for us. And I would point to places like hospitality, venues, events, retail, as facing extreme duress, but needing to adapt. And so therefore, we kind of point to those as strong opportunities as we go forward. Makes sense. Questions about that, Geoffrey, from your side? These are those great.
I find it interesting, with the residential element being kind of so low on the decline, because it feels like there's kind of two sides to that. Residential, I find, might actually be going up, but the corporate residential, I feel, would definitely be going down. So it's just interesting to see where the residential kind of element sits within your chart.
Yeah, it's a good call out. It also reflects the part of residential that we think of as addressable by professional AV services. So this is going to tend to be your more high end. I would agree with you, though. You made a great statement there about even say consumer residential. Let's call it like mobile technology. So for yacht, for RV, for just those kinds of experiences actually could be viewed as an upside right now. Because I think without the ability to travel internationally and kind of trepidation around, say, hotel or the normal venues that we would go to travel, we are seeing, if you go out to these associations like for mobile RV or for RV or for yacht, you're seeing sales increase.
Yeah.
So it's probably offsetting some of what we may have originally been thought of as consumer confidence hits and therefore pullbacks on residential spending. But you can think of a few example areas where it might be contrary. There might be another opportunity going on.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of transition as well, of course, from these companies now seeing that they can survive virtually. A lot of tech companies especially have now been realizing that they can just have 90% of their staff working from home and productivity stays the same, if not even better than they've had before. So it's been an interesting time to see some of these companies actually, relieving their corporate headquarters or downsizing companies that are in very high rent spaces or high lease spaces within some of these different cities and saying, you know what, we're just going to transition outside of the city and move into a smaller headquarters within the suburbs. And even people migrating into areas that they wouldn't normally migrate into because their job is dependent on living inside of a city, and you're starting to see people be a little bit more transient during these times, which I thought would be kind of the opposite. I thought people would kind of stay put, but you're seeing people actually move a lot more into some of these less populated areas, that still have the infrastructures to be able to work. But it's interesting to see the transient action or the transient time happen during the pandemic. And I think that might also impact some of those numbers as people get settled again, moving into 2021, when they've settled down in the areas they're going to be residing in, and companies have settled down into their normals, and see how that affects the AV industry as a whole, especially on the installation side, because it's, a lot of the work that's been done, especially on the corporate side, has been based off of having a lot of different rooms and meeting rooms and conference rooms. And now a lot of that, I think, is going to change quite substantially over the next 5 years.
Yeah, you could look at it as a need for substantial investment. So I'll be honest, I look at our long range forecast from Avixa on industry growth for 21 and beyond to 2025. And I think we're being extremely conservative because of what you just talked about. This is coming up in a few different sessions and conversations in the industry as well. How does office space get reimagined and changed to support what we're talking about here is a much more fluid workforce? I think there's appetite and interest in going back to some sort of office mode, or at least a space. And I'm hearing some interesting concepts. One of them being a hub and spoke concept, where you have, sure, your primary flagship configured different perhaps than it is today. It's not as big or as many offices in it, but it has places for people to meet and come in and out, check in and out, maybe a hotel fashion. But then the spoke idea to support, as you're talking about, people that have moved out of the big city, they may have someplace not too far away that they could go to. If they want to collaborate in person, they could go to a spoke to get out of the home, because as we talked about before, I think there is a bit of stir craziness. something different. I did this too. I think we all hopefully had a chance this year to work somewhere else for at least a period of time. So I think those kinds of changes in workforce behavior force and push for investment in different technologies and solutions in our office spaces. So gosh, what a great time to be a solution provider as we come out of this, because you're helping companies to reimagine. Hopefully installer integrators on this presentation and others are talking to customers about, hey, what are you thinking as you come back to office? Would love to help you consider reimagining that. Because I think, if anything, to me, our long-range forecasts look too low in light of what could be a massive period of innovation and investment to try to now account for and accommodate for this change to behavior that some of which will stick. At the very least, we look different than we did as a workforce before. So we have to shift accordingly.
Yeah, we have to adapt and change. It's something that's been in flux ever since March, I would say, basically every single company, I think, has been impacted one way or another from this whole pandemic, in good ways or in bad. A lot of the tech sectors and software companies are booming. Gaming companies are booming. Your main a lot of the commercial goods companies have been booming. But a lot of the entertainment-based companies, if they require any sort of live action or live intervention to each other, there's just, it's been hit very, very hard, which I think is why we've been seeing a lot of these transitions for virtual production, virtual workflows kind of coming into play. There was an interesting story about an event called Tomorrowland, which is an electronic music festival that takes place over in Belgium. I think it's Belgium, over in Western Europe, every year, and their normal attendance live, hits about 100 to 150,000 people. But this year they did the whole thing. They said, you know what, we've got to figure out what we're going to do here. So we're going to do it virtually. And they produced the whole event virtually, and they had over 2 million attendees to that event in a virtual environment. So It's just really interesting to see the diversity of, these events and these things happening in a real in-person manner to a completely virtual manner in a virtual environment. And it's going to be interesting, I think, to see how those numbers are impacted as well moving forward in the years ahead, and how some of these events are transitioning. Because just from hearing a previous interview from those guys, the question came up, well, moving forward, when we can go back to, say, living life in a normal fashion, whatever that may be, will you stop doing your event virtually? And their answer was absolutely not. We're gonna do it in both different ways. We'll have the in-person event and a virtual event. So because it opens up our range to viewers, and to have people that can't normally afford, the plane tickets and the accommodations and the transportation and, the food and everything else, to be able to go and attend those in-person events, they have the ability to still attend and be part of the event without having to pay that huge overhead cost. So
definitely.
I think it's going to be really interesting to see how those numbers affect everything holistically over the course of the next 5 years or so.
Yeah, for sure. If anything, show production has now become even more complicated because we've got to figure out how to deliver in two fronts at the same time. It used to be, I think we can all think back to, let's say, trade shows or other events we've been to. The online component was an afterthought. It was basically, well, we feel like, we want to have something up to at least extend the life of our conference beyond the time and place. But it really wasn't a concerted effort to truly engage in the way that we are now with distant audiences. So that same hub and spoke approach has some potential here too. Imagine where, yes, you have the main trade show, but you have, say, pop-up events kind of supporting throughout the world, and they're connected in a different fashion. How you facilitate that, how do you make it meaningful and exceptional, I think is going to be the challenge. So whole bunches of workflows and resources and investments that have to happen to support that for events going forward. So if anything, live events emerges stronger and even more diverse in a lot of ways in terms of the opportunity and the need for it. The complexity makes for opportunity for them, I think. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Something we look a lot at Avixa too, as event organizer producers. How do we do this? How do you do it?
I was gonna say that with the research that you're doing, it's gonna be interesting to see how that does impact some of the numbers, and how it transitions the workforce and the way that people are working kind of inside of production and experience and experiential design. I had a few people on the show recently as well, speaking about just experiential design and the impact on those experiential events, because it was really picking up. That whole market was on a roll before the pandemic hit, but they've still been able to do some really interesting things and be able to kind of retain a lot of the forward motion that they've been going, and they've kind of fed off of it. And even brands and retail spaces have found some very interesting ways to keep the experiential part of their brand moving forward and engaging with their customers. So it's definitely interesting times, without a doubt, and an interesting time to be in your shoes as well, working in the marketing and analytics areas.
For sure. Yeah. May you live in interesting times.
May us all.
Yes.
Well, Sean, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here. For the viewers to get best in touch with you, would it be just basically checking out your LinkedIn profile and your email?
Absolutely, that's perfect. LinkedIn's on the screen now. You can certainly reach out to me via email as well, swargo@avixa.org. We have a hashtag we use out there, hashtag Avixa Intel. If you want to tweet something that you're seeing, that you see in the space or from our data or anywhere about trends in Pro AV, please use it. Love to have a conversation with you that way.
That would be awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Sean. I really appreciate your time today. And for those of you watching, next week, I have my friend Philippe Bougeron on from Paintscaping. And we're going to be checking out different methods on projection mapping and speaking about a project that he recently completed actually here in Florida, mapping a rocket going up into space. So that's going to be a really interesting conversation to engage in as well. So for all of you watching, thanks again. And thanks again, Sean, for being on the show. And for everybody, stay ahead of the curve.
Thanks all.